Hello, my friends. Welcome to tonight's story. And as always, I want to thank you deeply for being here. Whether you are lying in bed with the lights dimmed, listening with headphones, or simply letting this voice fill your room as you prepare to rest, I am grateful for your time. If you enjoy falling asleep to slow history, to calm words that drift without hurry, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you will not miss the next episodes. And also, leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from, because I truly love to imagine how this story connects people across continents, across cities, across small towns, like a quiet thread stretched across the night sky. Tonight, we begin a journey into the life of royal mistresses in the Middle Ages, a subject that has always been spoken of in whispers, hidden behind the curtains of power, woven into the secret chambers of castles and palaces, where politics met passion, where influence was exercised not through crown or sword, but through proximity to a king's heart. The term royal mistress might sound like a scandal, a mere footnote of desire in the chronicles of Europe, but in truth, these women were far more than secret companions. They were confidantes, advisors, manipulators, patrons, and sometimes victims of the very power they touched. To understand them, you must step back into a world where dynasties rose and fell, not only on battlefields, but also in beds and chambers, where a whispered word in the dark could shape treaties, marriages, wars, and the fate of entire nations. The medieval world was built on strict hierarchies, rigid codes of morality, and yet behind every king's public image, there was often another life, less visible but just as powerful. The mistress was not always chosen for beauty alone. Often, she was chosen for wit, for charm, for the ability to ease the burdens of a ruler crushed beneath the weight of rule. And in return, she received privileges, wealth, influence, sometimes even estates or titles, though always without the security that came with being a queen. The life of a royal mistress was both intoxicating and perilous. It could raise a woman from obscurity to the height of influence, and with equal speed cast her into disgrace, exile, or worse. To trace this life, we must travel across courts French, English, Burgundian, Castilian, where women navigated a maze of intrigue, balancing their survival against the envy of queens, the suspicion of nobles, and the gossip of commoners. We begin in France, where the role of the maîtresse en titre, the official royal mistress, would later become institutionalized, but whose roots stretch deep into the Middle Ages. In the courts of the Capetians and the Valois, kings often relied upon women outside their marriages for companionship, for solace, and for counsel. Queens were bound by politics marriages, arranged to secure alliances, to join lands, to produce heirs. Love and intimacy were seldom their domain. The mistress, however, was chosen freely, often for affection, for charm, for the sparkle of spirit that could pierce the armor of royal duty. She could soothe, she could distract, she could entertain, and she could listen when the queen could not. Yet such intimacy was never private for long. Courtiers watched, chroniclers recorded, priests muttered, and soon the mistress's name would circulate as surely as that of generals or bishops. She might be scorned publicly, yet secretly courted by nobles seeking influence, by artists seeking patronage, by rivals seeking secrets whispered in her ear. In England, too, the mistress was not merely a companion. From the Anglo-Norman period through the Plantagenet reigns, chronicles make mention of women who shared the king's bed and bore his children. Some were hidden, others acknowledged openly. William the Conqueror, despite being noted for loyalty to his queen, fathered illegitimate children. Henry II of England, bound to Eleanor of Aquitaine in a tempestuous marriage, relied on the affection of Rosamund Clifford, the Fair Rosamund, whose tragic tale would later be embellished by legend, painting her as a victim of jealous revenge. Whether these stories are wholly true or partly myth, they reveal how the figure of the mistress captured medieval imagination, both feared and romanticized, vilified and pitied. But beneath the romance lies the reality of power. A mistress might secure favors for her family, lands for her children, titles for allies. She could whisper into a king's ear about which noble was trustworthy, which envoy should be believed, which policy should be pursued. Sometimes, she became the king's most trusted counselor. Precisely because she had no official role, she was outside the machinery of councils and parliaments, able to speak freely in the intimate stillness of night. Yet this freedom came with danger. For every rise, there was a fall. The higher she climbed, the sharper. Every decision could mean life or death for thousands. And trust was rare. A mistress, if loyal, offered a kind of companionship impossible to find in the rigid structures of councils and parliaments. With her, a king could be vulnerable, could laugh, could confide. And that intimacy, though private, had public consequences. Through whispered conversations, through subtle suggestions, through the intimacy of listening, mistresses shaped history. Their influence could decide appointments, sway policies, and alter the balance of power among rival factions at court. Yet the risks were immense. To be a mistress was to live on the edge of favor. A single shift in a king's mood, a single failure to please, could mean banishment, disgrace, or imprisonment in a convent. Many women who once glittered in luxury ended their days in obscurity. Their names erased from chronicles, their fortunes confiscated, their children marginalized. Others endured in memory, precisely because of the scandals attached to them. The mistress was remembered less for who she was, more for how she disrupted the image of royal dignity. And yet, without them, the history of the Middle Ages cannot be told. In every court, from France to Hungary, from Scotland to Naples, mistresses left traces in land grants, in letters, in gossip preserved by monks. Their presence reminds us that kings were not abstract symbols of authority. They were men of flesh and longing, whose private lives could alter the fate of kingdoms. And so, as we drift further into this story, we will follow these women more closely, not as legends, not as villains or saints, but as real figures navigating a dangerous world of power, faith, and secrecy. For in their lives we see the contradictions of the Middle Ages themselves, the collision between piety and desire, between the demands of the church and the realities of human need, between the solemn rituals of rule and the quiet whispers of the night. This is where the story of royal mistresses deepens, and where we begin to see not only individuals, but a role, a position at once unofficial and indispensable, condemned and courted, hidden and yet inescapably visible. As we now turn to specific lives, the story of royal mistresses becomes not only a reflection of power, but also a window into the deeply human experiences of women caught between desire, politics, and survival. In France, during the reign of the Capetian kings, one name stands out in early chronicles. Agnes Sorel, often regarded as the first official royal mistress of France, though she belongs more properly to the 15th century, at the court of Charles VII. Yet before her, in earlier centuries, women existed in this role, though not yet with titles or open recognition. Chronicles of the 12th and 13th centuries hint at companions, favorites, and lovers, who moved in the shadow of queens. Known but not officially named, Agnes Sorel's life allows us to glimpse the transition. She was not merely a hidden mistress, but a woman acknowledged, granted lands, showered with jewels, and recognized by the court as the king's beloved. She was praised for her beauty, her elegance, and her influence in lifting Charles VII from despair during the 100 Years' War. Chroniclers describe her as a shining star at court, yet they also condemn her extravagance, calling her a distraction from piety. Her sudden death at the age of only 28, possibly from mercury poisoning, perhaps from foul play, cast a shadow of mystery that still lingers. In her, we see both the heights and the perils of being a royal mistress, adored, enriched, yet vulnerable to envy, to slander, to sudden tragedy. England, too, provides its stories. Rosamund Clifford, remembered as Fair Rosamund, became one of the most romanticized figures of the 12th century. Her connection to Henry II was woven into legend by later generations, who imagined her hidden in a labyrinth at Woodstock Palace, safe from the wrath of Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. Tales of her being poisoned by the jealous queen may be myth, but the persistence of these stories shows how a mistress became a character in the theater of history, embodying themes of beauty, danger, and forbidden love. In truth, we know little of Rosamund's actual life, but we know that Henry granted her property in favor, and that after her death she was buried with honor at Godstow Abbey, where even the nuns respected her. Her tomb became a site of pilgrimage until centuries later it was destroyed by reformers who saw her as a symbol of sin. In these stories, the mistress is both real and mythic, a woman whose existence was documented yet distorted, whose presence revealed the contradictions of medieval kingship. Kings could wage wars for God and Christendom, yet in their private chambers they allowed themselves the solace of women who were not their wives, women chosen not by alliance but by affection. And society, though scandalized, never ceased to watch, to gossip, to immortalize their names in stories and ballads. In the courts of Castile and Aragon, similar patterns appear. Alfonso XI of Castile openly favored Leonor de Guzman, granting her lands, authority, and recognition even while married to Queen Maria of Portugal. Leonor bore him many children, some of whom would later become powerful nobles, shaping the course of Spanish history. But when Alfonso died, Leonor's fortunes collapsed. The queen, long humiliated, ordered her arrest and execution. Her life shows the brutal reality of being a royal mistress. As long as the king lived, power and privilege flowed. Once he was gone, vengeance and ruin often followed. This pattern repeated across Europe. A mistress's fate was tied not only to her own charm or wit, but to the survival of the man she loved. She could rise to dazzling heights of wealth, but with his death or his waning affection, she could be cast into exile, prison, or worse. And yet, despite the danger, mistresses continued to exist, to be sought, to be envied and hated, because they fulfilled needs that no queen, bound by politics, could fulfill. They offered love where marriage offered alliance, intimacy where duty demanded distance. They were scapegoated by the church and gossiped about by commoners, but they endured, leaving their marks on the politics of their age. When we look at these early examples, we begin to see the outlines of a role that, by the late Middle Ages, would become almost formalized. The mistress was no longer merely a hidden companion. She could be acknowledged, even celebrated, though always precariously. And through her life, we glimpse the hidden corridors of medieval courts, where power was not only in crowns and thrones, but in whispers and glances, in gifts of jewels, in moments of intimacy that shaped the fate of kingdoms. This is the paradox of the Middle Ages, a world that preached chastity yet thrived on desire, a world that proclaimed morality yet tolerated, and even relied upon the influence of women who lived outside its moral codes. The story of royal mistresses is the story of that paradox, and as we move forward, we will see it deepen, expand, and shape the very culture of medieval Europe. As the Middle Ages advanced into the 13th and 14th centuries, the place of the royal mistress began to shift from scattered whispers to something more structured, even if still officially unacknowledged. In earlier centuries, a king's private life was often left in shadow, veiled in silence by chroniclers who preferred to write of battles, coronations, and divine signs. But by the later Middle Ages, as courts grew larger and more theatrical, the mistress could no longer remain invisible. She became part of the spectacle, part of the machinery of court life, her presence acknowledged even when condemned. In France, the Capetians and their successors, the Valois, embodied this change. By the time of Charles V and Charles VI, royal mistresses were spoken of with familiarity, not only as companions, but as players in political intrigue. Courtiers knew that access to a mistress meant access to influence, and nobles learned to seek their favor as much as they sought the king's. The role was never official, there was no law, no statute, but in practice, everyone understood. The king might sit in council with his ministers by day, but by night he might confide in the woman who shared his chamber, and what he confided might shape decisions more than any parchment or seal. In England, the pattern followed as well. The Plantagenet and later Lancastrian courts were rife with rumors of royal favorites, women who, though never crowned, carried themselves with the dignity of queens within private walls. Chroniclers noted these relationships with disapproval, framing them as evidence of sin and decline, yet they recorded them nonetheless, unable to deny the influence they witnessed. This duality, the condemnation and the fascination, was a hallmark of medieval attitudes toward mistresses. On the one hand, they were symbols of lust, distractions from the king's duties, reminders of humanity's weakness. On the other hand, they were sources of stories, legends, and endless gossip, shaping how the people imagined their rulers not as distant symbols but as flawed, passionate human beings. As the role became more visible, it also became more dangerous. A mistress could not rely solely on affection to protect her. She needed allies at court, patrons among the nobility, sometimes even ties to powerful families who could shield her from envy and revenge. Without such protection, her fall could be sudden and catastrophic. For every Agnes Sorel, showered with jewels and influence, there were countless unnamed women who disappeared into convents or poverty when their favor waned. The Middle Ages were not kind to those who lost power. To be a mistress was to live in a precarious balance, wealth today, disgrace tomorrow. And yet, despite the risks, mistresses continued to thrive in courts across Europe. Their presence was not only tolerated but expected because kings were human, because marriages were political, because passion sought outlets beyond the rigid boundaries of dynastic duty. The institution of the royal mistress was never codified, but by the 14th century it had become almost customary, a silent acknowledgement of the gap between ideal and reality. To understand medieval monarchy, one must understand this gap. This double life where public image and private truth diverged. And in that divergence, the mistress found her place not in law, not in ceremony, but in the quiet power of intimacy, in the whispered word that could carry more weight than an army. This is where our journey now leads, into the heart of courts where mistresses shaped history not by command, but by presence, by attention, by the fragile yet potent force of influence that begins in the private chamber and echoes outward into the fate of kingdoms. By the 14th century, the presence of royal mistresses in Europe's courts was no longer simply a matter of rumor, whispered in taverns or monasteries. It was part of the very structure of political life, and though cloaked in scandal, it was impossible to ignore. In France, the reign of Charles VI revealed how deeply entwined mistresses could become in the workings of the monarchy. Known as the Mad King, Charles struggled with mental illness, and in his instability the court was often divided between rival factions, each seeking control of royal decisions. His queenship with Isabeau of Bavaria was fraught with tension, and yet even within that storm mistresses appeared. Women who offered him fleeting comfort or were used by ambitious nobles to gain proximity to power. Chroniclers denounced them as symbols of disorder. Yet their very denunciation proves how visible they had become. The mistress was no longer only a secret of the bedchamber, she was a figure around whom political struggles could coalesce. In England, during the reign of Edward III, the figure of Alice Perrers demonstrates this transformation vividly. She began as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Philippa of Hainaut, but soon became the king's favored companion after the queen's health declined. Alice wielded extraordinary influence, so much so that chroniclers accused her of manipulating the aging monarch for her own gain, of enriching herself and her allies, and of turning royal justice into a tool of favoritism. She sat openly beside Edward at court, dressed in gold and jewels, sometimes even presiding at tournaments and trials, a visibility that shocked contemporaries. Parliament itself condemned her, and after Edward's death she was banished, stripped of much of her wealth, though she fought fiercely to retain her place. Her story shows the paradox. The mistress could achieve immense power, almost queenly in scope, yet that power was fragile, always resented, always vulnerable once the king's protection was gone. Alice Perrers was not remembered as a romantic figure like Rosamund Clifford. She was cast instead as a symbol of corruption. Yet the very vehemence with which she was attacked reveals how much she mattered, how much she influenced, how deeply the presence of a mistress unsettled the ideal of a pious and orderly monarchy. In Castile, Leonor de Guzman's fate in the mid-14th century tells a parallel story. Loved by Alfonso XI, she bore him 10 children, each granted titles and estates, and her influence at court rivaled that of the queen herself. Yet when Alfonso died, Queen Maria took vengeance, ordering Leonor's imprisonment and execution. The children survived, however, and through them Leonor's legacy shaped Spanish nobility for generations. Here again, we see how a mistress could alter dynastic history, how her offspring, though born outside marriage, could rise to prominence and carry forward the bloodline of kings. In each of these cases, Alice in England, Leonor in Castile, the role of mistress was more than personal. It was political, dynastic, and cultural. They were not mere companions. They were forces that redirected wealth, shaped alliances, and altered the balance between crown, nobility, and church. And though chroniclers painted them as greedy, sinful, or destructive, what we glimpse through the shadows is a different truth. They were women navigating a world that gave them few choices, finding in intimacy with kings a path to power, to survival, to influence that otherwise would have been denied them. The very fact that their names survive, centuries later, means they mattered, that their lives left echoes in the great halls of history. And so the mistress of the 14th century was no longer invisible, no longer merely a whisper. She was a presence that could not be denied. A figure both condemned and indispensable, woven into the fabric of medieval rule itself. This is the world into which we now step more deeply. A world where passion and politics were inseparable, and where the fate of kingdoms could rest not only on the clash of armies, but on the quiet conversations of a king and his mistress in the stillness of night. By the 15th century, the figure of the royal mistress was no longer an occasional shadow, but a recognizable role in the theater of European courts. And while still condemned by the church and whispered about by commoners, she now appeared openly in chronicles, in letters, and in art. In France, the court of Charles VII brought this role to an almost institutional recognition through Agnes Sorel, remembered as the first official maîtresse en titre, the titled royal mistress. Unlike earlier women, whose presence lingered only in scandal or rumor, Agnes stood in the full light of court life. She was granted lands, bestowed with jewels, and acknowledged even in public ceremonies, her beauty praised by poets, her influence admitted by courtiers. Chroniclers describe her as radiant, a woman whose elegance seemed almost divine, lifting the weary Charles VII from despair during the darkest years of the 100 Years' War. While France suffered defeat and humiliation, Agnes's presence revived the king, and in that revival lay the seeds of recovery. Her support for Joan of Arc, her patronage of artists and monasteries, and her encouragement of reform gave her a place in history that transcends the title of mistress. Yet her life also shows the dangers of such prominence. To some, she embodied grace and inspiration. To others, she symbolized extravagance and sin. When she died suddenly at the age of 28, suspicion of poison lingered, a reminder that power without legitimacy was always precarious. But even in death, her image endured, immortalized in portraits, and remembered in chronicles as more than a fleeting companion, as a woman who shaped a king and thus a kingdom. In England, too, the 15th century bore witness to the growing visibility of mistresses. Kings of the Lancastrian and Yorkist dynasties, embroiled in the Wars of the Roses, found themselves surrounded by women whose intimacy carried political consequences. Though queens were chosen for dynastic alliances, mistresses offered loyalty outside those contracts, and their children, often illegitimate, became pawns in the turbulent game of succession. Some were acknowledged and given positions at court. Others were quietly provided for, hidden away yet still part of the dynastic fabric. The line between legitimacy and illegitimacy blurred in this period, as kings used marriage to secure alliances but relied on mistresses to satisfy personal needs, and sometimes to cement loyalty with noble families through favor and patronage. In Castile and Aragon, the legacy of Leonor de Guzman lived on through her descendants, who played crucial roles in shaping Spanish nobility. Her execution did not erase her influence. It scattered it into the bloodlines of dukes and counts, ensuring that the mistress remained a force even beyond the grave. This is one of the paradoxes of the late Middle Ages. Mistresses were condemned, yet their children were indispensable, woven into the tapestry of European aristocracy. Their very existence altered the destiny of realms, reminding us that private lives were never truly private in royal courts. By the end of the Middle Ages, the mistress had become both a scandal and a necessity, a contradiction embodied in flesh. Society denounced her while relying on her mocking, deed her while envying her, erased her in sermons while immortalizing her in legend. She was not queen, yet she was often more loved. She had no crown, yet she shaped the fate of kings. And though her name might be spoken with judgment, it was spoken nonetheless, and that in itself meant power. The 15th century therefore marks a threshold. The royal mistress, once hidden, now walked visibly through the corridors of power. Her life was dangerous, yes, but it was also enduring. And from this point forward, she could never again be erased from the story of monarchy. She had become part of it, indelibly, inevitably, and her story was now the story of kingdoms themselves. As we move into the later 15th century and approach the threshold of the early modern world, the role of the royal mistress begins to settle into something both more visible and more dangerous, more glamorous yet more precarious, more envied yet more resented. In earlier centuries, the mistress lived in shadows, her name recorded only in scandal or rumor. But now she walked in the halls of palaces in plain sight, dressed in silks, bearing jewels, welcomed and hated at once. The courts of Europe grew more theatrical in this age, and kings, increasingly surrounded by spectacle, allowed their private affections to bleed into the public eye. In France, the memory of Agnes Sorel lingered like a ghost, shaping expectations of what a mistress could be, but it also set a standard that others would be judged against. No longer was the mistress only a secret companion. She was a patron of artists, a supporter of causes, sometimes even a participant in political negotiations. Her chamber was not merely a place of intimacy. It was a salon, a gathering place where courtiers sought favor and nobles sought influence. The mistress became a gatekeeper, the one who could grant access to the king when ministers could not, the one who could soften a harsh decision or open the way for a petition. In England, this same pattern was taking shape. Though queens remained central to dynastic policy, mistresses became more openly acknowledged, especially in moments when political turmoil fractured royal marriages. During the Wars of the Roses, where claims to the throne were contested and legitimacy itself was fragile, mistresses could tip the scales. Their children, though illegitimate, could be married strategically, their families elevated, their alliances woven into the shifting web of power. The king's affection became not only a matter of gossip, but a tool of politics, and the mistress was at the heart of it, whether she wished to be or not. To the common people, she was often a symbol of corruption, a reminder that kings sinned like ordinary men, that even the anointed rulers of Christendom could not resist desire. Priests thundered against her, moralists painted her as a temptress, ballads mocked her name. Yet in the very act of denouncing her, society confirmed her importance, for she could not be ignored. Even in Italy, where city-states and principalities flourished with their own forms of courtly life, mistresses appeared at the edges of chronicles, tied to dukes, counts, and condottieri. The pattern was universal. Wherever there was power, there were women who touched it through intimacy, and wherever those women existed, they altered the course of politics. What is striking about this period is how clearly the mistress was seen as part of the fabric of court life. She was not legitimate, yet she was indispensable. She was not crowned, yet she was feared. She had no title, yet she could shape the fate of treaties and alliances. Her power was informal, fragile, and dangerous, but it was real. And it is here, in this late medieval world, that the image of the royal mistress becomes fixed. A paradoxical figure, condemned by morality, yet embraced by reality. Denied by law, yet elevated by practice. Hated by queens, yet envied by courtiers. She was, in her way, the embodiment of the contradictions of the Middle Ages itself, a living reminder that beneath the banners of faith and order, desire and humanity still burned. As we move further, we will see how this paradox deepened, how mistresses at the dawn of the early modern era became almost institutional, with their influence so visible that even kings no longer pretended to hide it. But here, in the 15th century, we can already see the transformation, from shadow to spectacle, from rumor to role, from whisper to presence. This was the world in which royal mistresses lived, balancing between the intimacy of love and the cruelty of politics, between the warmth of jewels and the chill of envy, between the softness of affection and the hardness of history. In the closing decades of the 15th century, the figure of the royal mistress grew even more defined, her influence undeniable, and her presence recorded with increasing frequency in chronicles, letters, and even in legal disputes. This was an age of and scission, when medieval structures of power were beginning to give way to the more centralized monarchies of the early modern world. And in that transformation, the role of the mistress became more visible, almost institutionalized. France provides one of the clearest examples. After the memory of Agnes Sorel, who had set the model for what a recognized royal mistress could be, the courts of Louis XI and Charles VIII showed how that precedent lingered. Louis XI, called the Spider King, was less openly indulgent, preferring calculation and secrecy. Yet even in his court, women close to him wielded influence behind the scenes. When Charles VIII took the throne, the tradition continued, with mistresses serving as intermediaries, courtiers whispering petitions through them, and nobles seeking their favor. These women were no longer merely companions. They were channels of communication, bridges between the private chamber and the machinery of state. In England, the same years were marked by turmoil, as the Wars of the Roses raged and legitimacy itself seemed fragile. Kings like Edward IV were notorious for their romantic entanglements, remembered for their charm and their many mistresses. Chroniclers, even those hostile to Edward, admitted his magnetism and the loyalty he inspired, a loyalty reinforced by his generosity to those he favored. Women such as Elizabeth Shore, often known simply as Jane Shore, became famous not only for their beauty, but for their influence. Jane Shore was beloved not just by Edward IV, but by the people of London, remembered for her kindness and her willingness to intercede for the poor. She shows another dimension of the mistress's role, not simply a figure of luxury and scandal, but someone who could use her position to soften the harshness of kingship, to grant mercy, to ease punishments. Yet her story also reveals the risks. For after Edward's death, she fell into disgrace, accused of conspiracy during Richard III's reign, forced to walk barefoot through the streets of London as penance. The crowd pitied her, but her humiliation shows how swiftly fortune could turn, how a woman once elevated could be cast into misery when the king who protected her was gone. In Castile and Aragon, too, mistresses left their imprint on politics, shaping alliances through their children and their connections. As the Reconquista neared completion, the courts of Ferdinand and Isabella stood as symbols of unity. Yet even here, the shadow of earlier mistresses lingered in the noble families descended from royal affairs. Across Europe, the pattern was the same. The mistress was both celebrated and condemned, both central and marginal, both indispensable and vulnerable. She was the queen without a crown, a presence impossible to ignore yet always denied official recognition. By the end of the 15th century, the mistress was no longer a passing figure. She was a fixture, her role as familiar as that of ministers or generals, her influence acknowledged even in the sermons that denounced her. She represented the gap between ideal and reality, between the church's teachings and the king's desires, between the public image of monarchy and its private truth. And as Europe prepared to step into the dawn of the 16th century, that gap would only grow wider, and the royal mistress would move from scandal to institution, from shadow to stage, shaping not only the lives of kings, but the course of kingdoms. By the close of the 15th century, the figure of the royal mistress had crossed a threshold, no longer an irregular shadow in the chronicles of kings, but a visible, recurring element of courtly life across Europe. The medieval world, with its castles, its knights, its prayers, and its wars, had always spoken in terms of order and hierarchy. Yet behind the banners of piety there was always this contradiction, this unofficial yet powerful presence. From France to England, from Castile to Burgundy, the mistress had become part of the language of power, not enshrined in law but woven into practice, not crowned but known, not praised but remembered. Each kingdom had its own version of the pattern, yet the similarities are striking. In France, the image of Agnes Sorel still glimmered like a jewel, shaping the courtly imagination for generations, a model of beauty and grace, remembered not as a shameful secret, but as a woman whose influence was undeniable. In England, Jane Shore's story, a mixture of kindness, influence, and downfall, remained vivid in memory, embodying both the heights a mistress could reach and the humiliation she could suffer once her protector was gone. In Castile, Leonor de Guzman's fate had already shown that a mistress could alter dynasties, her children rising to shape the nobility long after her own execution. In Burgundy, mistresses served as channels for alliances, negotiating between powerful dukes and rival factions, their letters and patronage preserved alongside the accounts of battles and treaties. Everywhere, these women remind us that medieval monarchy was never only about crowns, councils, and coronations. It was also about the private world of intimacy, where affection and passion could alter public policy, where a whispered suggestion at night could weigh as much as an army at dawn. And so, by the end of the 15th century, the mistress was no longer just a scandal. She was an institution in all but name. Chroniclers still condemned her, priests still thundered against her from the pulpit, and the common people still mocked her in ballads. Yet all these voices together only confirm how central she had become. She could not be erased, because she was already too deeply woven into the story of kingship itself. Her role reveals the paradox of medieval society, a culture that spoke endlessly of Christian virtue, chastity, and order, yet depended on women who embodied the opposite of its preached ideals. And yet, those women were not only survivors of hypocrisy, they were agents of history. They funded churches, they supported artists, they gave land to monasteries, they interceded for the poor. Some abused their position for greed, others used it for mercy, but all of them show us that power in the Middle Ages was not confined to thrones and councils. It flowed also through intimacy, through affection, through the fragile bond between a ruler and the woman he chose outside the rigid structures of dynastic marriage. To study them is to study the truth of medieval monarchy itself, not the polished facade of sanctity, but the living reality of human desire. As Europe crossed into the dawn of the 16th century, the mistress would not disappear. On the contrary, she would become more visible, more institutionalized, her presence formalized in courts that now celebrated spectacle and display. But the foundation of that later role was laid in the Middle Ages, in the centuries where secrecy turned to visibility, where whispers became acknowledgement, where the royal mistress ceased to be merely a shadow and became instead a figure history could not forget. As the 16th century began to dawn, Europe stood on the edge of transformation, and with it the role of the royal mistress entered a new phase, one that grew directly from its medieval roots, but now carried a sharper visibility, a clearer definition, and a greater influence. The Middle Ages had made her a figure both scandalous and indispensable, a presence whispered about but never denied. Yet in this new era, the mistress began to step into the light of spectacle. Courts had grown larger, richer, more theatrical, their rituals more elaborate, their politics more entangled with ceremony and display. Kings who once sought to preserve an image of piety now embraced the pageantry of power, surrounding themselves with symbols of wealth and beauty, and in this pageantry the mistress found her stage. In France, after the legacy of Agnes Sorel, the role of maîtresse en titre became almost expected at court. Charles VII's acknowledgement of Agnes had set a precedent that could not be erased, and the kings who followed lived under that precedent, whether they wished to or not. By the time of Francis I, the royal mistress would be an institution in itself. But even at the turn of the century, whispers of this new role were already taking shape. Courtiers no longer pretended surprise when a king's affection turned toward a favored woman. They watched instead for signs of patronage, of wealth, of opportunity that flowed from such intimacy. In England, too, the pattern was evolving. The later medieval tradition of figures like Jane Shore had prepared the way, and now kings moved more openly in acknowledging their favorites. The Tudors, who would rise to power at the end of the 15th century, would embody this shift, though their story belongs more fully to the early modern period. Yet the ground was already prepared by the practices of the Middle Ages. Royal mistresses were no longer irregular scandals. They were expected, tolerated, even woven into the culture of court politics, and with this expectation came both opportunity and danger. For the mistress herself, the rewards could be dazzling: estates, jewels, titles, patronage. She might serve as the center of a cultural circle, funding poets, painters, musicians, and architects. She might soften the harshness of royal justice, interceding for the poor or the condemned. She might shape foreign policy through subtle influence, tilting the king's favor toward one ally or another. Yet with every gain came the risk of envy, of hatred, of slander whispered not only by enemies, but by allies eager for her fall. Queens, bound by duty yet often humiliated by their husbands' openness, could turn from silent endurance to vengeance. Nobles, jealous of their diminished influence, could accuse her of witchcraft or corruption. Priests could thunder from pulpits, declaring that the mistress embodied the decay of Christian kingship, the sign that rulers had fallen prey to temptation and sin. And the people, watching from outside the gilded halls, could cast her name into ballads and gossip, mocking her even as they envied her jewels. By the dawn of the 16th century, the mistress was no longer invisible. She was woven into the very fabric of monarchy, a paradox embodied in flesh, unofficial yet central, condemned yet courted, fragile yet powerful. Her presence tells us that kings were never only symbols of law and faith. They were men of flesh, and in their desires we glimpse the private currents that shape the public fate of kingdoms. And so, when we step into this new chapter, we see not a departure from the Middle Ages, but a continuation, an unfolding of what had long been hidden. The mistress of the 16th century was born in the chambers of the medieval courts, and her story is the story of Europe itself caught between faith and desire, between order and passion, between the solemn rituals of rule and the quiet whispers of the night. As the 16th century unfolded, the royal mistress moved steadily from the shadows into a position so visible that even those who condemned her could not deny her importance. In France, this transformation was clearest. The example of Agnes Sorel had long set the tone, and the kings who followed embraced what had once been hidden. Under Louis XII and then Francis I, the figure of the mistress became almost a fixture of courtly life. Her presence expected, her influence courted. Francis I, in particular, remembered for his love of art, learning, and magnificence, surrounded himself with women whose beauty and wit were as much a part of his court as the tapestries and frescoes that adorned his palaces. Chroniclers who once whispered in disapproval now wrote more openly, sometimes mocking, sometimes praising, but always acknowledging. The maîtresse en titre was not a queen, but she had a household, attendants, patronage networks. She could befriend poets, commission buildings, intercede for prisoners. She became a visible part of the cultural and political fabric of the kingdom. In England, a similar change was taking place, though shaped by the turbulence of the Tudor dynasty. Henry VII, cautious and frugal, left little record of mistresses, but his son Henry VIII would shatter all precedent, his passions becoming the engine of politics, his marriages and affairs, altering not only the fate of England, but the very faith of the kingdom. The roots of this lay in the medieval tradition of royal mistresses, already accepted as part of court life. But with Henry VIII, they became not only companions but catalysts of history. Anne Boleyn, before she was queen, was spoken of as mistress, though her ambition reached far beyond the chambers of intimacy. She reminds us that the line between mistress and consort was not always fixed. Sometimes a mistress could rise, changing her place entirely at the cost of her safety. This was the danger and the opportunity of the role in its most visible form. In Castile and Aragon, united under Ferdinand and Isabella, the mistress was less prominent, as the Catholic monarchs projected an image of piety and unity, yet the legacies of earlier centuries still lived in noble families descended from royal affairs. The silence here is telling. It shows us that even when kings and queens strove to appear as paragons of Christian virtue, the memory of mistresses lingered, embedded in genealogies, estates, and alliances. Across Europe, the pattern was unmistakable. The mistress was not an accident, not an aberration, but a recurring presence. She was denounced from pulpits as a sign of corruption, yet courtiers knew that petitions could succeed if they reached her ear. She was scorned by queens, yet sometimes tolerated when her presence secured the king's favor or eased his temper. She was feared by nobles who knew that her influence could destroy reputations or elevate families. The mistress in this period was at once despised and indispensable, condemned and courted, fragile yet powerful. And so, as the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance, the role that had begun in shadows now stood in candlelight, glittering with jewels, her laughter echoing in great halls, her whispers carrying into the decisions of councils. This was no longer the mistress of rumor alone. This was a woman whose presence was acknowledged by history, for she had become, in her paradox, a necessary part of kingship itself. By the end of the 15th century and the beginning of the 16th, the role of the royal mistress had become a paradox so deeply woven into the fabric of monarchy that it could not be erased, no matter how loudly priests condemned it or how bitterly queens resented it. What began in shadows during the medieval centuries had now become almost an office in itself, unofficial but recognized, condemned but indispensable. The mistress had evolved from rumor to reality, from a whispered scandal to a visible presence at court. In France, she could walk with jewels and silks, commanding a household of her own, her patronage extending to artists, poets, and scholars, her influence reaching into the king's most intimate decisions. In England, she could rise from a simple ladyian, waiting to a figure whose smile and laughter could alter the course of dynastic politics, her name remembered in ballads and in chronicles alike. In Spain, her legacy could survive execution, her children shaping noble families long after her own life ended in tragedy. And across the courts of Europe, from Burgundy to Naples, the same pattern appeared again and again. The mistress was both scapegoat and power broker, both despised and envied, both fragile and central. To understand her is to understand the contradictions of medieval monarchy itself, for kings lived as symbols of Christian order yet acted as men of flesh and desire, and in the gap between the symbol and the man the mistress found her place. She was not queen, yet she often held the king's heart more closely than the crowned consort did. She had no title, yet her presence shaped treaties, wars, and alliances. She had no crown, yet her jewels sparkled more brightly than those of queens. Her fate, however, was never secure. Every mistress lived in the shadow of danger, the danger of sudden death, of poison, of banishment to a convent, of disgrace once the king's favor cooled. But for all the risks, they endured, and their names endure with them, because history itself could not ignore the weight of their influence. And so, as the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, the story of royal mistresses was no longer merely the story of hidden desire. It was the story of politics, of dynasties, of culture itself. It was the story of how women, in a world that denied them crowns, found ways to touch power nonetheless, to shape kingdoms with their presence, to leave echoes in the halls of palaces and in the pages of chronicles. And though they were condemned, though their names were sometimes cursed, their memory lingers, because the truth of monarchy is not only in laws and battles, but in whispers, in secrets, in nights when kings listened more closely to the woman beside them than to the council around them. The Middle Ages, in their contradictions, had created a role that would only grow in the centuries to come. The royal mistress, queen without a crown, shadow without silence, scandal without erasure. Her story was the hidden heart of kingship, and as Europe moved into a new age, she would remain at its center, shaping destinies from behind the veil of intimacy. Her life as fragile as a candle flame, yet as enduring as the stone walls of the castles where she once walked. As we move deeper into the 16th century, the legacy of the Middle Ages reveals itself most clearly in the way royal mistresses became not only tolerated, but almost expected, their presence shifting from whispered scandal to accepted reality within the grand performance of monarchy. In France, the precedent of Agnes Sorel had long prepared the way, and with Francis I, the role of the maîtresse en titre was solidified into something like a semi-official institution. Francis was a king of the Renaissance, a ruler who reveled in art, music, and spectacle, and his court glittered with brilliance. At the center of that brilliance stood women who, though uncrowned, bore the weight of influence as great as any minister. Francis did not hide his affections, and in this new openness, the mistress became both admired and feared. She could grant favors, she could bestow wealth, she could draw artists and scholars into her circle, and in her presence, the court learned that access to the king might depend less on the formality of councils, and more on the intimacy of private conversation. In England, a parallel story was unfolding, though one tinged with far more turbulence. The Tudor dynasty, rising from the ashes of the Wars of the Roses, made the mistress both a source of passion and a catalyst for revolution. Henry VIII, whose reign would transform England's church and throne alike, reveals more starkly than any medieval monarch the dangers and the power of intimacy at court. Before Anne Boleyn was queen, she was the object of Henry's fascination, his mistress in all but name, and through that fascination, England itself was remade. Here we see how the medieval tradition had laid the groundwork for something unprecedented. A mistress whose influence was so great that it toppled a queen, altered foreign alliances, and even led to the break with Rome. The mistress of the Middle Ages had whispered in shadows. The mistress of the 16th century spoke in a voice that could echo across Christendom. In Spain, though Ferdinand and Isabella cultivated an image of piety and marital unity, the legacies of earlier royal mistresses remained embedded in the genealogies of noble families, their bloodline shaping alliances long after their own names had faded. Even in the Catholic monarch's effort to embody virtue, the memory of mistresses revealed how deeply they had been woven into the structure of monarchy. Across Europe, the shift was clear. What had once been a paradox became a pattern. Mistresses were not crowned, yet they were present. They were not queens, yet they held power. They were condemned, yet they endured. To study them is to see the truth of monarchy in its fullness, not only its crowns and ceremonies, but its secrets and contradictions. The 16th century, more theatrical and more dangerous, gave mistresses new opportunities and new perils, but it did not create them. They were born in the Middle Ages, in the gap between faith and desire, and by this time they had become inseparable from the story of kingship itself. And so, as we walk further into this age, we must remember that the royal mistress was not an invention of scandalous rumor. She was the embodiment of monarchy's hidden heart, the living reminder that rulers were not only symbols of God's order, but human beings of flesh, desire, and longing, and that in the silence of the night, history itself could be reshaped by a whisper. As the 16th century deepened, the figure of the royal mistress became impossible to ignore, not only for those who lived within the glittering halls of power, but for chroniclers, poets, and even foreign ambassadors, who understood that the influence of a king's companion could rival that of ministers or generals. In France, the role of maîtresse en titre under Francis I set a standard that would endure for centuries. Yet even before the title was fixed, women close to the king shaped policy and patronage. Francis adored beauty, wit, and conversation, and his mistresses provided all of these, surrounding him with a circle that embodied Renaissance culture itself. They were patrons of artists, protectors of poets, and often intercessors for the poor or ambitious courtiers. A petition that might falter in the council chamber could find success if whispered into the ear of the king's beloved. And in this, the medieval paradox of the mistress, condemned yet indispensable, evolved into something closer to an acknowledged reality, woven openly into the machinery of monarchy. In England, Henry VIII's reign revealed the mistress's power in its most dramatic form. Before Anne Boleyn wore a crown, she was seen as a mistress, and in that role she revealed how intimacy could alter not only the private life of a king, but the fate of a kingdom. Henry's desire for her was not satisfied by secrecy. It demanded marriage, legitimacy, elevation, and that demand shattered the unity of the Church, leading to the English Reformation. Here, more than ever before, the line between mistress and queen blurred until it broke, showing how the traditions of the Middle Ages had set the stage for revolutions of the early modern world. Anne's rise and fall demonstrate both the allure and the danger of such intimacy. She replaced a queen, shaped religion and politics, and yet ended her life condemned, her neck severed by the sword. Beyond Anne, other women Mary Boleyn, Elizabeth Blount, and later Catherine Howard remind us that the presence of mistresses in Tudor England was not unusual but constant. Their lives tied to the shifting tides of royal favor, their names preserved in chronicles as symbols of both beauty and tragedy. In Spain, the outward silence of Ferdinand and Isabella's reign masked the legacies of earlier centuries. But in the courts of their descendants, the mistress again emerged, shaping alliances and patronage in the Habsburg tradition. Across the courts of Italy and the German states too, noblewomen who became mistresses influenced art, politics, and warfare, their letters surviving as proof that even when official chronicles tried to erase them, their presence was known and felt. The mistress of this century was not merely an ornament, nor merely a scandal. She was a power, unofficial yet undeniable, shaping dynasties and cultures at a time when Europe itself was being remade by discovery, by war, by reform. She carried within her the legacy of the Middle Ages, the paradox of a world that preached virtue yet depended on desire, a world that crowned queens for politics yet allowed mistresses to shape hearts and decisions. To walk through this history is to see monarchy not only as a chain of battles and treaties, but as a web of affections and intimacies, fragile and powerful, whispered in chambers yet echoed in history books. And in the mistress we find the truth of that web, the human thread that bound kings to the reality of longing, the thread that reminds us that even the most powerful were still human, vulnerable to love, to passion, to the dangerous sweetness of the heart. By the middle of the 16th century, the royal mistress had become so firmly woven into the fabric of monarchy that she was no longer a surprise, no longer a hidden scandal whispered in monasteries or markets, but a figure expected and acknowledged, as much a part of courtly life as the ministers who advised the king or the nobles who carried his banners. In France, the brilliance of Francis the Scored made this presence shine all the brighter. The king, lover of art and splendor, surrounded himself with women whose wit, grace, and beauty embodied the ideals of the Renaissance, and through them, culture itself was shaped. The Maitresse and Tetra had her own apartments, her own retinue, her own power to protect allies and punish enemies. She was not queen, yet she had the ear of the king at every moment, and courtiers knew well that fortune might be gained or lost in a glance from her. In England, Henry VIII had revealed more starkly than any medieval monarch the dangerous potential of this role. Where earlier mistresses had whispered influence in shadows, Henry's passions remade crowns, thrones, and even the church itself. Anne Boleyn rose from fascination to queenship, and in her rise, England was severed from Rome, the Reformation began, and the very faith of the kingdom was reshaped. Yet her fall revealed the fragility that never vanished from the mistress's life, for though her influence changed history, her body still paid the price of intimacy with a king who grew cold. Jane Shore in an earlier century had walked barefoot in disgrace. Anne Boleyn walked to the scaffold. Both stories tell the same truth, that the mistress's power was dazzling but always perilous, enduring only as long as a king's heart beat with affection. In Spain, though Ferdinand and Isabella projected unity, the noble families of their heirs carried in their blood the legacies of mistresses who had once lived in royal chambers, their descendants proof that such relationships shaped dynasties as surely as legitimate unions did. And across the Holy Roman Empire, in Italy, in Burgundy, the same figure appears again and again, not crowned, not consecrated, but present, powerful, indispensable. What the 15th century had hinted at, the 16th century confirmed. The mistress was not an accident of monarchy. She was its reflection, its contradiction, its hidden heart made visible. She was proof that kings were men, bound by desire, vulnerable to affection, swayed by intimacy as much as by diplomacy. And she was proof that women, though denied thrones, could still touch power, could still shape the destiny of kingdoms, could still leave echoes in the chronicles that tried so hard to erase them. The story of the mistress, by this point, is not only the story of scandal or sin, it is the story of politics itself, the story of art and patronage, of mercy and vengeance, of lives that reveal the deepest contradictions of an age that called itself Christian, yet depended on desire, an age that proclaimed order, yet was shaped by intimacy. And so, as we close this chapter, we see clearly that the Middle Ages had given birth to a role that by the Renaissance was unshakable. The royal mistress, queen without a crown, stood at the center of courts that glittered with power and secret, why alike. Her story is the story of monarchy itself, not the polished image of sanctity, but the living truth of humanity, whispered in chambers, sung in ballads, condemned in sermons, and remembered in history. As the 16th century reached its later decades and the Renaissance blossomed into its most magnificent display, the royal mistress had become not merely a tolerated figure, but an expected feature of monarchy, her presence so visible that courtiers shaped their ambitions around her. Ambassadors wrote of her as though she were a minister, and poets sang of her beauty and her power. What the Middle Ages had whispered, what earlier centuries had hidden in shadows, was now a central spectacle of courtly life. France stood at the forefront of this transformation. With Francis I, the tradition of the Maitresse and Tetra had already taken form, but under his successors it hardened into custom. Henry II openly cherished Diane de Poitiers, a woman nearly 20 years older than him, whose elegance, intelligence, and control over court culture made her more queenly than Catherine de' Medici. The actual queen, Diane directed patronage, influenced policy, and even controlled symbols of power, such as the royal emblems engraved with her initials entwined with the king's. She was a mistress, not hidden but enthroned, proof that intimacy could shape politics as openly as any council. And yet this power brought peril, for Catherine never forgot the humiliation. And after Henry's death, Diane was forced to yield her estates and retreat from prominence. Still, her decades of dominance revealed that the mistress had become a semi-formal role, a fixture in the palace as real as any chancellor or marshal. In England, Elizabethan politics did not center on a king's mistress, but the shadow of mistresses still haunted memory. The fall of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard showed that intimacy with Henry VIII could raise a woman to the heights of queenship but also destroy her utterly. Though Elizabeth I claimed the Virgin Queen's image, her court was filled with gossip about favorites, and foreign ambassadors, remembering the Tudor tradition, assumed that intimacy might still rule behind the veil of secrecy. Thus, even in absence, the figure of the mistress lingered, a ghost of politics that had not disappeared but shifted. In Spain, the Habsburg court projected piety, yet within its walls, mistresses remained, their presence known if not always acknowledged, their children woven into noble lineages, their patronage sustaining artists and monasteries. Across Europe, the pattern held. In Italy's princely states, in the German courts, mistresses lived with open recognition, some treated with ceremony nearly equal to wives, others remembered as patrons of art and architecture, their initials inscribed on palaces, their portraits hanging alongside dukes and counts. The late Renaissance mistress was no longer a figure of rumor alone. She was part of the stage, her power exercised openly, her presence shaping the very culture of monarchy. Yet for all the glitter, her position remained precarious. She might reign for decades, as Diane did, or vanish in an instant at the king's death, her jewels stripped, her allies abandoned, her memory condemned by the very court that once bowed before her. The contradiction never vanished. She was indispensable yet disposable, central yet fragile, celebrated yet condemned. And in this contradiction, we see the true legacy of the Middle Ages. For the royal mistress embodied the same paradox that had always haunted monarchy between the sacred and the profane, between the official and the secret, between the eternal symbol of kingship and the fleeting desires of a man. Her story in the late Renaissance shows us not only the endurance of this role, but its transformation into something the world could no longer ignore. She had stepped fully into history, and history itself could not look away. The later 16th century offered some of the clearest examples of how the mistress had become both a cultural icon and a political force, her power so visible that it rivaled queens themselves. In France, the life of Diane de Poitiers stands above all. Beloved of Henry II, she held a place so exalted that even foreign ambassadors recognized her as the true center of influence. Though older than the king, her beauty was celebrated as eternal, her elegance unmatched, her wisdom in financial and political matters respected even by rivals. She wore black and white, the colors of mourning for Henry's father, and by this subtle display she bound herself to Henry with an aura of loyalty that seemed unshakable. Her initials were entwined with the king's on palaces, fountains, and documents. She received titles, estates, and treasures that placed her among the wealthiest in France. Her word could grant patronage, save reputations, and direct the course of policy. Catherine de' Medici, Henry's queen, endured this humiliation for decades, waiting in silence for her revenge. Only after Henry's death did she strike, forcing Diane to surrender her jewels, her palaces, and her position. Yet Diane's long reign as mistress shows how far the role had come since the Middle Ages, for she was not hidden but enthroned in all but name, acknowledged by courtiers, chroniclers, and even by the symbols of monarchy itself. In England, though Elizabeth I did not take a husband and therefore had no royal mistresses in the conventional sense, the memory of Henry VIII's mistresses and consorts still haunted the political imagination. Ambassadors in Elizabeth's court watched her favorites closely, suspecting intimacy, reading political meaning into every glance, every smile. They had learned from the Tudor tradition that a woman close to the ruler could alter policy, and though Elizabeth was careful to guard her image as the Virgin Queen, the shadow of the mistress as a force of history remained. In Spain, under Philip II, the image of piety was projected with great severity. Yet whispers persisted of women who held influence through intimacy, their children woven into noble genealogies, their estates evidence of royal favor. The contradiction was never erased, even in the most devout of courts. And across Italy, in Florence, Ferrara, Mantua, the pattern held. Powerful dukes surrounded by women whose intimacy gave them political weight, their portraits preserved, their patronage visible in chapels and villas that still stand today. What unites these stories is not the individual fate of each mistress, but the larger truth. That by the late Renaissance, the role of the mistress was not simply a scandal, but a recognized part of monarchy's structure. She could shape diplomacy, patronize art, enrich her family, and change the balance of power among factions. She could be celebrated as beautiful and wise, or condemned as corrupt and manipulative, but she could never again be ignored. And yet her position remained as precarious as ever. All her wealth, her jewels, her palaces depended on the favor of one man, and when that man died, or when his love cooled, her fortunes could collapse overnight. Diane de Poitiers, despite her decades of dominance, was stripped of her treasures the moment Catherine de' Medici found her opportunity. Jane Shore in England, once beloved, walked barefoot through the streets in humiliation. Anne Boleyn, once exalted to queenship, met the axe. These fates remind us that the mistress was powerful but never secure, dazzling yet vulnerable, central yet always exposed. She embodied monarchy's contradictions, the majesty of crowns and the fragility of human desire. And so, as the 16th century reached its height, the mistress stood as both a jewel of power and a warning of its dangers, her story echoing through the chambers of palaces and into the chronicles of history. By the final decades of the 16th century, the figure of the royal mistress stood revealed in all her contradictions, no longer merely a scandal hidden in chronicles, but a role acknowledged by the structures of monarchy themselves. The world that had once denounced her from pulpits now built palaces where her initials were carved into stone. The kings who had once hidden such relationships in secrecy now flaunted them in processions and ceremonies. And yet, for all this visibility, her life remained bound by fragility, a fragile jewel glittering in the candlelight of court spectacle. France offered the clearest display. After the dominance of Diane de Poitiers, Catherine de' Medici herself wielded power not only as queen, but as regent. And in that power, she reshaped the politics of intimacy. Mistresses did not vanish, but their place was altered, caught in the web of Catherine's watchful eye. Later in the Valois court, during the reign of Henry III, favorites and companions of both genders surrounded the throne, showing how intimacy in all its forms shaped politics. The mistress by now was not scandal alone. She was a symbol, a figure courtiers expected, ambassadors reported on, and foreign rulers considered when weighing the balance of French policy. In England, Elizabeth I's long reign created an unusual contrast. She claimed chastity as her crown, the Virgin Queen, and yet the role of intimacy in politics did not vanish. Ambassadors who had seen how Henry VIII's mistresses had shaped the kingdom still searched for equivalents in Elizabeth's court, reading too much into the Queen's favor toward courtiers like Robert Dudley. Even in the absence of an acknowledged mistress, the shadow of the role haunted English politics, proving that the tradition of the Middle Ages could not simply be erased, for the imagination of courts had already been shaped by it. In Spain, under Philip II, piety was emphasized with even greater intensity, yet the presence of intimate companions remained, their children integrated into noble families, their names whispered in courtly circles. Across Italy, in Florence, Mantua, Ferrara, and Naples, mistresses left visible marks. Villas built in their honor, chapels endowed with their wealth, artworks bearing their likeness. The paradox persisted everywhere. The mistress was essential yet condemned, central yet unofficial, envied yet despised, celebrated in poetry yet cursed in sermons. Her power was undeniable, her downfall inevitable. What the 16th century revealed most clearly was that this figure, born in the contradictions of the Middle Ages, had become inseparable from monarchy itself. Kings could not rule without them, nor queens ignore them, nor chroniclers erase them. They were too deeply woven into the culture of power. And yet, as every story reminds us, their security was always fragile. One king's death could mean exile, confiscation, disgrace. One rival's victory could mean imprisonment or execution. The same intimacy that raised them could destroy them. And so the mistress of the late Renaissance embodied the eternal contradiction of monarchy. That power, even when dazzling, was never secure. That influence, even when immense, could vanish in an instant. Her story is the mirror of kingship itself, the reminder that beneath crowns and coronations lived human desire, fragile and ungovernable, shaping history from the shadows. As the 16th century ended, the mistress was no longer only a medieval phenomenon. She was a Renaissance figure, her influence expanding across culture, politics, and art. But her foundation was medieval, her roots buried deep in centuries of whispers, scandals, and secret power. And it is here, at the close of the Renaissance, that we see most clearly the legacy of the Middle Ages. The royal mistress, queen without a crown, power without legitimacy, a figure condemned yet unforgettable, fragile yet enduring, fleeting as candlelight yet lasting in history's memory. As Europe crossed into the 17th century, the story of the royal mistress revealed its full legacy. What had begun in secrecy during the Middle Ages, what had grown in visibility through the 15th century and reached brilliance in the 16th, was now undeniable, a fixture of monarchies so embedded that even those who condemned it could not pretend it did not exist. In France, the figure of the maîtresse en titre became institutional, a role understood as much as that of a minister or general. The lessons of Agnes Sorel and Diane de Poitiers had prepared the ground, and their successors carried the tradition forward into an era where court life was spectacle itself. The mistress had apartments in the palace, her own staff, her own ceremonies. She could commission works of art, direct the careers of poets, influence foreign policy, and shape the very image of the king. She was no longer a shadow, she was a star in the firmament of monarchy. In England, the Tudor legacy left a deep imprint. Henry VIII's entanglements had already proven that intimacy could alter faith and throne, and though Elizabeth I had cloaked herself in the image of the Virgin Queen, the expectation of mistresses returned with the Stuart kings. James I, Charles I, and later Charles II would all be remembered for their companions, whose influence on politics, religion, and culture echoed across generations. By this point, the medieval paradox of the mistress, condemned yet indispensable, fragile yet powerful, had become an accepted feature of monarchy. To the people, she remained a figure of fascination and scandal, mocked in ballads, sermonized against in churches, whispered about in markets. To courtiers, she was a gatekeeper, a source of patronage, a potential ally, or a dangerous rival. To ambassadors, she was a political actor, worthy of mention in dispatches to foreign courts. And to the kings themselves, she was comfort, intimacy, counsel, sometimes love, sometimes obsession, but always part of the fabric of rule. The roots of all this were medieval. Without the centuries of shadows, whispers, and contradictions, the 17th century mistress could not have existed so openly. The Middle Ages had shaped the role, had allowed it to survive beneath the weight of piety, had permitted it to grow in the spaces between duty and preference. By now, it had flowered into something undeniable, inseparable from monarchy itself. And yet, for all its brilliance, the fragility remained. The court confidant could hold power, could dazzle with wealth and influence, but her fate was still bound to shifts of favor and the dangers of rivalry. She was central but never secure, visible but never invulnerable. That contradiction, born in medieval courts, still defined her even as the modern age began. And so, as we enter this final stage of our story, we see not an ending, but a culmination. The court confidante, once a private presence, had become part of history itself. Her life a mirror of monarchy's contradictions, her presence a reminder that power is never only crowns and swords, but also quiet counsel after hours, jewels in candlelight, and the fragile yet enduring force of human ties. In the 17th century, the role of the court confidant reached a level of visibility and influence that would have been unimaginable in the early Middle Ages. Yet its foundations were laid centuries before, in the contradictions of medieval kingship. France, under the Bourbon dynasty, displayed this transformation most brilliantly. Henry IV, remembered as the king who ended the great religious conflicts, was also renowned for the number of his companions, his court figures so numerous that chroniclers recorded their names alongside his decisions and decrees. He openly acknowledged them, granted them estates, and elevated their households, weaving them into the very fabric of the nobility. This openness surprised moralists, but it revealed a truth that the medieval world had always known but seldom admitted, that closeness shaped politics as surely as diplomacy did. With Louis XIII and then Louis XIV, the tradition became fully formalized. At the court of the Sun King, where Versailles itself was constructed as a theater of monarchy, the confidante was no longer merely an addition to the story, she was one of its leading characters. The recognized confidante maîtresse en titre had apartments in the palace, her own retinue, and a defined role in the spectacle of power. Madame de Montespan, confidante of Louis XIV, exercised such influence that ministers and nobles sought her favor as though she were a queen. She was a patron of the arts, a distributor of wealth, and for a time, the most prominent woman in France. Though her eventual fall during a notable court case showed that danger never vanished, her prominence confirmed that the confidante was by then an institution, inseparable from monarchy itself. In England, the Stuart kings revived the expectation of such figures after the relative restraint of Elizabeth's reign. Charles II, in particular, was known for his many companions, their names and faces etched into the memory of the Restoration Court. Barbara Villiers, Nell Gwynn, Louise de Caraway, these women were not hidden but widely known, painted and sung about, their families recognized, their influence undeniable. They were symbols of a monarchy restored after years of civil conflict, symbols of vitality and charm, yet also reminders of the fragility of power, for they too could fall from favor in an instant. The 17th century made visible what the Middle Ages had concealed, that the confidante was a political figure, a cultural force, a mirror of monarchy itself. She was envied and criticized, celebrated and condemned, a paradox made visible. And though the age of Versailles and the Stuart courts lay beyond the strict boundary of the medieval world, they were born of it. The direct heirs of the centuries when spouses were chosen for alliances but confidantes selected through personal preference, when strict virtue was preached, but politics thrived on proximity. The 17th century courts only made visible what had always been true, that monarchy was never only crown and altar, but also backstage corridors and council rooms away from the crowd, and that history itself was shaped not only in councils and campaigns, but in quiet conversations after hours. And so we reach the end of our long journey, from the shadows of the medieval courts to the brilliance of the 17th century palaces. And in this journey, the figure of the confidante has revealed herself not as a marginal presence, but as a central paradox of monarchy. In the early Middle Ages, she was scarcely named, her existence hinted at in chronicles by clerics who preferred to portray rulers as entirely restrained. Yet she was there, a companion out of view, a steady presence in times of crisis, a channel for influence unseen. By the High Middle Ages, her presence became undeniable, as stories of Rosamund Clifford, of Leonor de Guzman, of women remembered in both sympathy and controversy, showed that closeness could shape dynasty, lay her influence courted by nobles and feared by queens. Agnes Sorel marked the transition, her jewels and her grace illuminating the Valois court, her sudden death reminding all of the dangers. By the 16th century, the mistress had moved fully into the stage of history, her role no longer hidden but institutional. Diane de Poitiers reigned beside Henry II with power greater than the queen herself, her initials carved into palaces, her name written into the chronicles of France. In England, Henry VIII's passions turned mistresses into queens, reshaped religion, and altered the destiny of an entire nation. And by the 17th century, with Versailles glittering and the Restoration Court dazzling London, the mistress was an institution as familiar as the crown itself. Yet through all these centuries, from shadow to spectacle, her role remained precarious. She could hold jewels, estates, and influence, but all depended on the fragile favor of one man. At his death, or at the cooling of his affection, she could be stripped of everything, humiliated, banished, or worse. She was indispensable yet disposable, central yet marginal, celebrated yet condemned. And in this paradox, she mirrors monarchy itself. For kings, too, were both powerful and fragile, sacred and sinful, human and divine. To remember these women is not only to tell stories of scandal, but to acknowledge the truth of history. That power is never only in crowns and councils, but also in intimacy, in affection, in the desires and vulnerabilities of human beings. The mistress was not queen, yet she was the hidden queen of hearts, shaping kings who shaped nations. She was not crowned, yet her whispers could weigh as much as armies. She was not consecrated, yet her presence was a sacrament of monarchy's contradictions. And though the Middle Ages have long ended, her legacy endures. For every court that came after carried the memory of these women, their triumphs and their tragedies, their brilliance and their falls. They remind us that history is not only banners and battles, but also the quiet chambers where decisions are born in silence, where a king's heart might turn the fate of a kingdom. Tonight, as we close this story, we carry their memory with us. The lives of royal mistresses in the Middle Ages were fragile, glittering, dangerous, and unforgettable. They show us the truth of monarchy, not as a polished symbol of order, but as a living reality of desire. And perhaps that is why their story lingers, why their names, though condemned, are still spoken, why their presence, though denied, is still felt. For in them we see not only scandal but humanity, not only sin but survival, not only fragility but endurance. And in that endurance lies the true legacy of the Middle Ages, whispered still in the silence of history.